It's impossible to talk about Lake Huron without mentioning the storm of 1913. Dubbed the White Hurricane by survivors, it was the most destructive storm to hit the Great Lakes in recorded history. The region experienced hurricane-force winds for extended periods, with gusts exceeding 90 miles per hour, and waves frequently topping 25 feet or 11 meters. 19 ships were lost, and another 19 narrowly avoided disaster when the storm forced them ashore. Over 250 sailors lost their lives, and a majority of those losses occurred on Lake Huron. Before we get too deep into things, I want to take a quick second to talk about this video's sponsor, Surfshark. I'm an independent content creator, so I spend a lot of time working from home. And whenever I get really sick of my tiny New York City apartment, I like to go and work in coffee shops. But that unfortunately means using public Wi-Fi. And when you use public Wi-Fi, pretty much anyone up to no good can potentially access your private information. That's why I'm really glad that I have Surfshark to protect my online data. Surfshark encryption offers an additional layer of protection that keeps my data safe when I'm using public Wi-Fi, so none of those creepy cyber crooks can access my information. But that's only half of what makes Surfshark such a great deal. They have over 3,200 servers in over 100 countries all over the world, so you can route your connection from almost anywhere. When you're traveling, you can always stay connected, and better yet, you can connect through other countries to access content libraries and streaming services that aren't always available in your country. And now Surfshark is offering an incredible deal for Black Friday. Just use the code OLDBOATS at checkout to get up to 6 months free. Thank you again to Surfshark for once again supporting the channel. Check them out using the link below. And now, back to Lake Huron. The fall of 1913 started mild, with fair weather and temperatures easily reaching the mid-50s. And by November 5th, it looked as though the freighters of the Great Lakes would easily fit in 1 or 2 more runs before the end of the season. But by the morning of Sunday, November 9th, as a line of ships left the St. Clair River and entered the southern end of Lake Huron, the stretch of good weather had come to an end. On the steamer George C. Crawford, Captain Walter C. Iller quickly realized this foul weather would be far worse than he had anticipated as the sky above his ship turned black early that afternoon. Thick snowfall reduced visibility to almost nothing as the freighter struggled north. As they passed Point of Barks, the massive waves were tearing the Crawford apart. Green water smashed over her pilot house and roared down the length of the ship. Skylights and vents were ripped open and water flowed into her engine rooms, threatening to extinguish her boilers. Captain Iller recognized that his ship couldn't take much more. Desperate to escape, he decided their only hope was to reverse course and make a mad dash south, where they could shelter in the St. Clair River. Unaware that the same maneuver would doom so many others that night, he ordered his ship to reverse course. Miraculously, the waves calmed just long enough to turn the mighty freighter south. As they began their race for safety, Captain Iller knew that at any moment a massive wave could force his battered ship into a deadly trough. In the early evening, there was just enough light to see other ships fighting through the storm. Not long after making their turn, Iller saw a familiar sight. The freighter Argus, barely holding her own in the maelstrom. Built by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio, the Argus, labeled Yard Number 326, was launched on August 5, 1905. Originally named the SS Lewis Woodruff, she began her career with the Gilchrist Transportation Company, based out of Cleveland, Ohio. She measured 436 feet or 133 meters in length, and came in at 4,707 tons. In 1913, she was sold to the Interlake Steamship Company and renamed Argus. Under the command of Captain Paul Gutch, the Argus sailed the same path north as the Crawford with a load of coal and a crew of 25. Still heading upbound, the Argus probably had a clear view of the Crawford as she passed by on her dash south. Captain Iller made note of the other freighter, but he was too busy fighting the storm to exchange any real greeting. The distance between the two ships grew. Captain Iller made one last look back at his fellow mariners. Then, just before the Argus passed out of view, Captain Iller saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He later recalled, "The Argus seemed to crumple like an eggshell. Then, she was gone. The hull of the mighty ship failed in the massive swells. She snapped in two and almost immediately plunged to the bottom. Captain Iller could do nothing but continue fighting to save his ship and crew. When they reached the southern end of Lake Huron, they struggled to locate the mouth of the St. Clair River. Iller attempted to signal to the engine room with the Chadbourne telegraph, but the bending and twisting of the ship's hull stretched the cable so taut that the telegraph handle wouldn't budge. Unable to find the river, they dropped anchor, hoping to ride out the storm, but both anchor chains snapped. A little after 2 a.m., with little other option, Captain Iller decided to turn his ship once again and head north to face the wind and seas head-on. A brief clearing in the storm gave him the window he needed, and after a tense dash, the Crawford finally found shelter in the St. Mary's River. When it was finally safe to go out on deck, the men began clearing the ice. They were horrified to find numerous missing rivets and massive cracks in her hull. The Crawford only narrowly avoided the same fate as the Argus. The crippled ship limped to Toledo, Ohio, where she would undergo several months of repairs. But the ship and her crew survived the storm. What happened on the Argus in her final moments will never be known. In the days and weeks after the storm, various pieces of debris washed ashore in Bayfield, Ontario. Soon, the body of Captain Paul Gutch was discovered and identified. He didn't wear a life jacket. At first, it was thought he just didn't have time to don one. But then, the body of Mrs. Walker, the ship's second cook, was found. She wore the life jacket marked Captain. In his final moments, Captain Gutch did what he could to save her, but it was no use. All 25 people on board the Argus that night lost their lives. While the storm of 1913 caught many captains off guard, others recognized the signs of the coming gale. Captain Charles A. Fox of the SS Choctaw was one of those lucky few who kept his ship in the safety of Marquette Harbor on November 9, 1913. He was the last to see the massive Henry B. Smith as she sailed into Lake Superior, one of the many ships that wouldn't survive the night. The Choctaw featured an unusual design. Launched on May 25, 1892 by the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company, she was constructed at a time when steel hulls were relatively new on the Great Lakes, and builders were experimenting with the best design to efficiently meet the growing demand for raw materials. The Choctaw, named for the Southeast Native American tribe, combined the briefly popular whaleback design with a conventional bow. This hybrid design, known as monitors, semi-whalebacks, or straightbacks, failed to gain traction, and only 3 were ever built, including the Choctaw's identical sister ship, Andaste, and the nearly identical Yuma. It's worth noting that all 3 of these ships eventually sank, although decades apart and under vastly different circumstances. Measuring 267 feet or 81.4 meters in length, and coming in at 1,574 tons, the Choctaw could carry up to 2,500 tons of cargo, typically iron ore or coal. Her hybrid design shared the same flaws as traditional whalebacks. Her inward-sloping, tumble-home design sides made her decks virtually inaccessible in even mildly heavy seas. But after sailing her maiden voyage in June 1892, she proved to be exactly what her owners, the Lake Superior Iron Company, had hoped for: a sturdy and reliable, no-nonsense workhorse. She kept this reputation when she was sold to the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company in 1894. But her 2-decade-long career wasn't without incident. In April 1893, one of her cylinder heads exploded, killing 2 of her firemen and severely injuring another. In May 1896, she collided with a larger freighter, L.C. Waldo, and settled on a shoal near the Sioux Locks. She was refloated and repaired. Then, in May 1900, she briefly ran aground, and in April 1902 she struck a rock and partially sank before reaching Marquette Harbor. But after that, her career became far less eventful. That all changed on the night of July 11, 1915. The The Choctaw was sailing north from Cleveland bound for Marquette with a full cargo of coal. As they steamed out of the St. Clair River into Lake Huron, they were soon enveloped in a thick fog. Leaving only just before the Choctaw, Captain Nelson Brown of the much larger freighter James A. Reed reduced his engines to half speed. But the Choctaw sailed past the Reed, continuing at full speed, and soon disappeared into the fog. Rules dictated that speed should be reduced by half in such conditions, but this guideline was almost universally ignored. Captain Brown was lucky. The owners of the Reed made safety a priority, and they trusted their captains to exercise caution, even if it cost them money. But this was very rare, and Captain Fox of the Choctaw was one of the vast majority under immense pressure to deliver their cargo as quickly as possible no matter the conditions. To avoid liability, if anything went wrong, captains would frequently report haze instead of fog in their logs. Fog dictated half speed. Haze was vague, and speed was up to the captain's discretion, so the Choctaw continued full ahead even as visibility fell to almost nothing. For many years, Lake Huron was a free-for-all, with up and downbound ships sailing anywhere they wanted to on the lake, and the confusion led to numerous collisions. Fed up with the unnecessary losses, the Lake Carriers Association, made up of American ship owners, finally agreed on designated up and downbound lanes. This would have solved the situation, but these rules were only agreed to by the Americans. Canadian ship owners, for whatever reason, neglected to sign on, and their vessels ignored the designated lanes. Captain Cornelius Deneen of the 230-foot or 70-meter-long Canadian freighter Wakonda was under the same pressure as Captain Fox as he sailed south with a cargo of wheat bound for Montreal. For hours, Captain Deneen kept careful watch, maneuvering past numerous upbound vessels. A little after 2 a.m., the exhausted captain retired to his cabin to get some rest. In such conditions, captains are expected to remain on the bridge, but Deneen left orders with his first mate, David Chambers, to wake him if another vessel was heard or spotted. 3 times, the captain was summoned to the bridge. Each time, he shepherded his vessel as they passed the other ship and then retired once again to his cabin. Chambers was a capable mate. The 29-year-old was actually once a captain himself on a vessel called the J.H. Plummer, but he was stripped of his master's license after running the ship aground in similarly foggy conditions. Only a few moments after Captain Deneen retired to his cabin for the 3rd time, he was summoned once again at around 4:30 a.m. As he arrived on the bridge, Chambers reported that they heard another ship's whistle, and it sounded relatively close. Deneen let out 3 quick blasts from his own whistle, which were promptly answered by the other vessel. After exchanging a few more whistle blasts, it was apparent to Deneen that the other vessel was somewhere around 2 points off his starboard bow, and likely directly crossing his path. He ordered the engines full astern and grabbed the wheel himself, swinging it hard to starboard as fast as he possibly could. But it was too late. Suddenly, the Choctaw appeared in the fog. A moment later, the Wakonda sliced into her between her first 2 hatches. Her bow heaved deep into the other ship, nearly slicing her in 2 had they not hit at the junction of her heavy framing. Soon, the forward force of the Choctaw and the reversing of the Wakonda parted the 2 ships, and just as quickly as she had appeared, the Choctaw once again faded into the fog. Captain Deneen sprung into action. After quickly assessing that his heavily damaged ship would survive her injuries, he immediately searched for the Choctaw. His mate Chambers and watchman Charles Cleason scanned the horizon for the crippled ship. They soon heard the cries of men in the fog, shouting that their ship was sinking. The Wakonda limped forward until finally they sighted the tall funnel of the Choctaw emerging from the fog, now pointing at a strange angle as the ship quickly foundered by the head. On the Choctaw, from the moment the other ship sliced into them, it was clear that their ship was doomed. Captain Fox almost immediately ordered the lifeboats lowered while the Choctaw began listing to port as her bow settled into the water. She then shifted to her starboard side and quickly rolled over as her stern briefly lifted out of the water before making her final plunge. In just 17 minutes, the Choctaw was gone. The crew was able to launch 2 lifeboats, but she sank so fast that several crew members were forced to jump overboard and swim to the boats. Miraculously, all 22 crew members survived, and they were soon picked up by the Wakanda. The Choctaw's owners sued the owners of the Wakanda, alleging that the collision was the fault of the Canadian ship. But it was quickly pointed out that the Choctaw was also sailing at or near her full speed without a watch posted at her bow, and they did not properly respond to the Wakanda's warning, creating confusion. Eventually, the court found both vessels equally at fault, and damages were divided. The loss of the Choctaw was easily preventable, but lessons from the disaster were quickly forgotten. In the fall of 1883, the month of November was living up to its terrible reputation as a series of punishing storms moved down the Great Lakes. On November 15th, in the midst of one of these gales, the schooner J.N. Carter was sailing south on Lake Huron with a load of lumber when she overshot Kincardine Harbor and ran aground 2 miles south of town. Trapped in a dangerous position, the captain of the stranded Carter fired off distress flares that were quickly spotted on shore. In those days, this sort of situation was not all that uncommon, and several salvage tugs sat at ports up and down the lakes ready to pull stranded ships to safety. Soon, a tug called the Erie Belle was dispatched to tow the Carter back to port. By 1883, the Erie Belle had been in service for over 20 years. She was built in Cleveland, Ohio by Peck and Masters and began her career under the name Hector, serving as a tug in Lake Erie during the Civil War. Coming in at 122 feet or 37 meters in length, the Hector proved a versatile ship, and in the years after the war, she served as a passenger and package freighter on the western end of Lake Erie. But then, in November 1873, she caught fire and partially sank in the Detroit River. The fire did significant damage, and it was assumed that she would soon be scrapped. But her hull was found to be in decent condition, and she was soon purchased by a man named Captain J. Leframbois, who refurbished the ship and named her the Erie Belle to replace another vessel called the Lake Breeze, which also burned and sank. She changed owners once again, and in 1879 she ran across a schooner's anchor chain, causing significant damage to her hull. She immediately flooded with 10 feet of water, and it was once again believed that the steamer had reached the end. But she was refloated, repaired, and converted back into a tugboat. On the morning of November 21, 1883, the Erie Belle arrived at the scene of the crippled J.N. Carter, and her crew of 12 established a tow line. They attempted to pull the schooner from the mud, but she wouldn't budge. Again and again, they pushed the Erie Belle to her limits, trying to muster all the power they could to free the stranded ship. Her boiler had just been upgraded the year before, and her crew no doubt felt confident that she was up to the task. They tried once again, pushing her to her absolute max. But then, in an instant, a massive blast shattered the modest wooden vessel. Her boiler overheated and exploded. Four crew members were killed instantly, and the other 8 were sent flying overboard. The survivors were soon rescued, along with the crew of the J.N. Carter. While the exact cause of the blast remains a mystery, it's commonly believed that a relief valve might have been wired shut by a crew member in an attempt to generate more power. The engine then overheated and began to seize, trapping even more steam until finally, the boiler reached its bursting point. The shattered hull of the Erie Belle sank almost immediately. Her wreck washed ashore on a beach near Kincardine, Ontario. Soon, her splintered wood either washed away or was salvaged, leaving behind just her damaged boiler. An illegal salvage attempt brought it closer to shore, and it's still visible today at a site that has since been named Boiler Beach. By the final weeks of the 1879 season, it was clear that the aging side-wheel paddle steamer, PS Waubuno, was nearing the end of her career. Built in 1865 by the Millington Simpson Shipyard for J&W Beatty & Company, the Waubuno was designed to carry passengers and freight primarily on Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. Her name was derived from the Algonquin word for a powerful form of magic or sorcery. The sturdy 150-foot or just under 46-meter long sidewheeler quickly proved a reliable workhorse. Ownership soon passed over to the Georgian Bay Transportation Company, and the profits generated by the Waubuno made it possible for the company to invest in larger and more modern ships. The mid to late 1800s saw rapid changes in shipbuilding technology, and though she was only 14 years old, the Waubuno was already hopelessly outdated. The Georgian Bay Transportation Company placed an order for a larger replacement vessel that would be ready to take her place in 1880. By the end of 1879, the Waubuno was finishing out her final season carrying freight and offering low-rate passenger tickets. On November 18, 1879, Captain George Plumpton Burkitt sat in his pilot house while moored in Collingwood, Ontario, waiting to begin what was almost sure to be his vessel's final run. But heavy snow and lashing winds delayed their departure. For days, the ship creaked and groaned in the storm as Captain Burkitt eagerly awaited a break in the gale so he could finally get underway. The Waubuno carried $10,000 worth of miscellaneous freight, including everything from crates of apples and sugar to a team of horses and a handful of cows. Her passengers waited out the storm scattered between a nearby hotel and the homes of hospitable locals. Finally, just after 4 a.m. on November 22nd, the storm finally seemed to clear. Or at least offer enough of a break that Captain Burkitt believed his humble ship could manage. Word was passed to the hotel, and some of her sleepy passengers made their way to the dock. But eager to finally begin, Captain Burkitt didn't wait long, and the Waubuno quickly departed, leaving many of her intended passengers behind. When she finally set sail, she carried just 10 passengers with a crew of 14. Bound for Parry Sound, the Waubuno sailed north and soon reached Christian Island, where the lighthouse keeper John Hoare recognized her lights and recorded the sighting in his logbook. His entry noted, "A stiff wind from northwest, but ship seemed to be riding well with full cargo." While Captain Burkitt had the option of sailing nearly the entire passage through waterways mostly protected from the full force of the wind, these narrow and rocky passages depended on good visibility and careful navigation. At first, visibility was on Captain Burkitt's side, but soon, around 8 hours after their departure, the wind and snow picked up once again, creating near whiteout conditions. Not far away, near Moose Point, a group of lumbermen working in the storm heard the blast of a steamer's whistle somewhere in the whiteout. The sharp blasts repeated over and over again, and then faded away. While someone familiar with the sea would recognize the distress signal, the lumbermen assumed it was just two vessels signaling to each other, and they continued on with their work. There's little chance these men could mount any real rescue, even if they had recognized the cries for help. Meanwhile, another steamer called the Magnetowan left Collingwood on the same route a few hours after the Waubuno, carrying many of the passengers who missed sailing on the ill-fated ship. Not long after leaving, conditions rapidly deteriorated, and Captain O'Donnell quickly realized it was not safe to continue. He found shelter near Christian Island and waited nearly 40 hours for the fierce gale to pass over Georgian Bay. When they finally reached Parry Sound, Captain O'Donnell learned that the Waubuno still hadn't arrived. Having seen no trace of the ship while following the same route, Captain O'Donnell could only assume the worst, and a search party was immediately sent out. Scattered debris from the Waubuno soon washed ashore. Strangely, every one of her life jackets were recovered, but not a single one showed any signs of use. It's assumed that the weather took a turn right when Captain Burkett reached a gap between safe inlets. With almost no visibility, he couldn't risk taking shelter in one of the many narrow channels. He might have turned back, looking to seek shelter in the gap between Moose Deer Point and Copperhead. In desperation, he dropped his anchors, but there was almost no hope that they would hold in such heavy seas. Then, just 4 months after she vanished, the overturned hull of the Waubuno was found floating in a serene bay behind Moose Point, just east of a then uncharted shoal now known as the Haystacks. Her machinery and cabins were all gone, likely ripped away as the vessel capsized. They probably took her passengers and crew with them. Not a single body was ever found. In 1962, one of her anchors was discovered and turned into a memorial in Parry Sound. While almost completely forgotten today, the Waubuno left her mark on the area. The narrow channel where Captain Burkett is believed to have tried to turn back is now called Waubuno Channel, and the then unmarked shoals have all been charted. And the island where her overturned hull was discovered is now fittingly called Wreck Island. But her passengers, including Mr. B. Noel Fisher, publisher of the Parry Sound newspaper North Star, and newlyweds Mr. and Mrs. W. D. Dupe, have all but been forgotten. Mr. Dupe had just finished his medical training and was headed north to establish a practice in the tiny McKellar village. His new wife awoke in the night before their ill-fated voyage screaming. In her vivid nightmare, she saw the Waubuno wrecked in a storm. The last sight she remembered was her new husband fighting for his life in the frigid water. She begged to delay their voyage and told several locals about her premonition. But in the end, the young woman boarded the Waubuno with her new husband, never to be seen again. Charles Murphy was sure that he was going to be sacked when he entered the office of his employer, Jasper H. Cheadle, on the afternoon of October 26, 1905. Cheadle managed a fleet of vessels on the Great Lakes, and Murphy was there to explain why he wasn't on his ship, the SS Kaliyuga, which was now on her return voyage to Erie, Pennsylvania. But the moment he walked in, Jasper Cheadle looked as though he had just seen a ghost. The ship in question, the SS Kaliyuga, went missing days ago, and Cheadle just received a telegram informing him that a thorough search of the area found absolutely nothing. The freighter and her crew were considered lost, and Charles Murphy's misfortune turned out to be an incredible stroke of luck. The SS Kaliyuga was a wooden-hulled steamship constructed by the Simon Langle Shipyard in St. Clair, Michigan in 1887. Designed to carry iron ore, she measured in at 269 feet or just under 82 meters in length. Her name came from the term Kali Yuga in Hinduism, which refers to the fourth of 4 ages of the world. Considered to be the worst of the 4, it roughly translates to Age of Darkness. I have no idea why such a name would be selected for a ship, but if you have some insight, let me know in the comments below. Over her long career, the Kaliyuga was subject to a few minor groundings and mishaps, the worst of which saw a barge she was towing sink after a collision with another steamer near the St. Clair River. The accident killed 1 crew member. By 1905, the once impressive Kaliyuga was easily dwarfed by the new steel-hulled freighters that now dominated the lakes, easily doubling her size and tripling her cargo capacity. Still, the reliable old ship soldiered on. She departed Marquette, Michigan early in the afternoon on October 18, 1905, bound for Erie, Pennsylvania. Short a second mate, the Kaliyuga sailed with just 16 crew members. Ordinarily, a ship of her size would require a crew of between 24 and 26. It's likely being so short-handed that her deckhands would have had to help down below to keep the boilers fed and the engines running. It was a less than ideal situation. And this wasn't typical, and it's thought that perhaps Captain Fred Tonkin, only in his first year mastering a vessel, was trying to keep costs as low as possible to impress his employers. When Charles Murphy didn't return in time to join them, Tonkin declined to find a replacement and sailed on without him. Faster than expected loading allowed them to leave earlier than what Murphy was told, which is why he missed the departure. Regulations passed in 1915 and after required vessels to sail with adequate crew numbers and clearly defined roles. As the Kaliyuga passed through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie and entered Lake Huron early on the morning of October 19th, they soon faced a strong gale that swept over the lake from the northeast. The storm hit only after the Kaliyuga reached the open lake, far from any safe anchorage. Captain Tonkin was forced to sail on. By noon, the gale was proving exceptionally brutal, forcing ships all over the lakes to fight for their lives. Numerous vessels were pushed ashore, and in Lake Erie, a schooner barge called the Tasmania was lost with all hands. Just after 4 p.m., the Kaliyuga was sighted by the steamer Frontenac around 7 miles east of Presque Isle, Michigan, struggling through the storm, but appearing to hold her own. Then, right around sunset, she was spotted by Captain John Duddleson of the freighter L.C. Waldo, somewhat south of where she was last spotted, struggling east at a painfully sluggish pace. With such low crew numbers, it's doubtful they were able to maintain the speed needed to maximize her power and fight through the storm. Captain Duddleson was the last living soul to see the Kaliyuga. Not long after Charles Murphy met with his employer, the ship's shattered pilot house was found by the steamer Lily Smith in Georgian Bay near Cove Island. 3 days later, the body of oiler Charles Barrand was found washed ashore 3 miles south of Kincardine, Ontario, wearing a Kaliyuga life preserver. He was identified by a letter found in his pocket. It read, "Dear Father, goodbye. I have a bank book in the Cleveland Society of Savings. Goodbye, Mother, dear sister, and brother. A kiss for all." 3 more bodies were found over the next few days, as well as other scattered bits of debris. Where and when exactly the Kaliyuga went down remains a mystery. The distance between where her pilot house was found and where the bodies washed ashore leaves even more questions. Some believe she foundered somewhere near the middle of Lake Huron, and shifting winds pushed her pilot house and the bodies southeast. But that would put the disaster somewhat close to the Waldo. Captain Duddleson and his crew never heard a distress call or saw any flares. Others believe she reached Lake Huron's eastern shore and tried to round the Bruce Peninsula to shelter in Georgian Bay, but hit a shoal and sank late in the night. As of the making of this video, her wreck has never been found. Charles Murphy was reassigned the following season, and he enjoyed a long and prosperous career on the lakes. His lucky misfortune made him a bit of a minor celebrity in the area, and he would often tell his story at social gatherings. But his luck was bittersweet, knowing all the while that his fellow crew and the captain that he admired so much spent their final hours fighting through a storm on a ship that was undermanned and hopelessly outmatched by the fury of Lake Huron. Thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Till the next one, be nice to people.